Coming up on New Day at Arirang, South Korea forecast to see another 14,000 new cases of COVID-19 on Friday. With the 5-day-long Lunar New Year holiday just a day away, the government is maintaining its current social distancing guidelines despite the recent rapid uptick. The international community responds to North Korea's 6th missile launch of the year. South Korea, the US and Japan all criticize the North for unnecessarily raising tensions. But Seoul and Washington say they're still open for talks with Pyongyang on the regime's denuclearization. Plus, some welcome economic news for President Biden. US GDP grew at an annual rate of 5.7% in 2021, the highest annual growth in some 40 years. And the country's GDP spiked almost 7% in the final 3 months of the year.
Hello and welcome to this Friday edition of New Day at Arirang. It's 8 a.m. on January 28th here in Seoul, South Korea. Thank you for joining us. I'm Kim Mo-kyan.
And I'm Mark Broom. Over the next hour, we'll take a look at some of the biggest news stories of the day and get expert insights on the issues facing South Korea and the world. Our top story this morning, though, the Omicron strain of COVID-19 continues to spread rapidly here in South Korea, leaving daily caseloads well in excess of the 10,000 mark. This coming ahead of the big Lunar New Year holiday. It's going to last 5 days, and we'll see millions of people in South Korea travel around the country to visit their relatives.
For more on this and related updates, we have our reporter Shin Yeun here with us in the studio. Good morning, Yeun.
Good morning.
So let's start with the infections we're expecting for today.
Right, well, again, we're expecting to see Friday's figures stay near the 14,000 mark. Up to 9 p.m. yesterday, recorded 11,804 infections. This was a drop of 606 from a day ago, but still quite a large number compared to just 4 days ago, when only some 7,000 were logged during the same time. And daily infections have been doubling faster than authorities had forecast. During a special briefing held Thursday to explain what the Omicron variant entails, KDC Commissioner Cho Gue-sung said though the strain is quite concerning, it's not to an extent that it threatens medical capacity.
After analyzing the regions in Korea hit hardest by Omicron, we realized that the number of infections increased exponentially, but the number of those in critical condition was actually lower than the average tally in the country. We've seen the number of critically ill come down and have restored stability in our medical capacity with enough hospital beds available.
Okay, so that briefing was specifically about Omicron and how South Korea plans to deal with it. What were some of the key takeaways?
Right, so experts who participated in Thursday's briefing said Omicron isn't as fatal compared to other variants. It's actually comparable to a seasonal flu, but with symptoms a bit more severe. Citing a study from the UK, experts explained most people who were infected with Omicron reported having a cough, runny nose, headache, fatigue, and sore throat. While Omicron may not cause people to develop severe illnesses, it can still weigh heavily on our medical capacity, given that it's twice as transmissible as the Delta variant. There were also questions in regards to whether our current testing kits were effective enough, especially since we've seen 4.5% of imported Omicron cases classified as stealth Omicron. Like its name, the stealth Omicron is a subvariant known as BA2 that hasn't been easily identified using PCR tests. But Cho Gue-sung gave assurances that Korea's homegrown variant PCR tests have been able to detect this strain. She added that this subvariant isn't of concern yet, but monitoring will continue. As to how Korea will tackle the spread of Omicron, the KDCA chief cited the importance of efficiently utilizing our limited medical and quarantine resources.
We are expanding the number of hospitals and clinics that are able to monitor patients being treated at home. We're also planning to bring in some 31,000 courses of antiviral pills at clinics by the end of January. They're currently being used on those with weak immunity and seniors over 60 to prevent them from developing severe illnesses.
And that explains why the country is set on using rapid antigen test kits as the latest screening method for most of the population instead of PCR tests. Excluding people over 60, those at high risk, or those who came to close contact with an infected person, Everyone else will have to test themselves with a rapid antigen test kit at testing sites or even at local hospitals starting February 3rd. Now, testing sites across the nation will have them ready from Saturday. Likewise, authorities are also set to keep the current social distancing measures in place instead of toughening them even after the Lunar New Year holiday, when many are expected to travel and visit their relatives.
So, Yin, exactly how many people are expected to travel over the Lunar New Year holidays, and what do authorities, kind of have any advice for them?
Right, some 28.7 million people are expected to move across the nation from this Friday all the way to February 2nd. The Ministry of Land, Infrastructure and Transport forecast an average of 4.8 million people to travel each day during the holiday. This is an increase of 17% from last year. The government is highly recommending people to refrain from traveling as a whole, but to those that must go, they're asking them to get booster shots and COVID-19 tests ahead of time. Also, to make their visits short, refrain from using public transportation and rest areas along the road. Also, to wear masks that are certified KF80 or higher at all times.
All right, Yin, thank you so much for your report. Have a happy and safe holiday.
You too.
Thank you very much. Happy New Year to you. Moving on to another big story of the day, North Korea has confirmed that it tested a long-range cruise missile system and surface-to-surface tactical guided missiles on Tuesday and Thursday, respectively.
The North state-run media says Kim Jong-un did not attend either of the launches, instead reportedly visiting a munitions factory. The report says the cruise missile test conducted on Tuesday by the North's Academy of Defense Science flew for over 2.5 hours, hitting a target island 1,800 kilometers away. The international community was again quick to react to North Korea's latest missile launches. The United States said it's still prioritizing the North Korea issue. The UN and the EU are calling on the regime to halt aggressive actions that threaten international peace and security. Our North Korean affairs correspondent Kim Dami with the details.
The U.S. State Department says that North Korea's nuclear issue is still top of Washington's agenda, reiterating that diplomacy and dialogue are the most effective means to achieve denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. State Department spokesperson Ned Price noted on Thursday that the U.S. has no hostility toward the North and is open for dialogue whenever and wherever. The Pentagon also made clear the same day that Washington is equally focused on dealing with the threat posed by the North as it is with all other major security issues. The UN has once again expressed a deep concern over North Korea's continued missile activities. Its spokesperson Stefan Dujarric said during a briefing on Thursday that diplomatic dialogue should get back on track, aimed at complete and verifiable denuclearization of the regime. Germany's foreign ministry also condemned Thursday's missile launch by the North, pointing out such activities clearly violate UN Security Council resolutions. The European Union repeatedly called on Pyongyang to halt missile launches that threaten regional peace and security and go against international efforts to resume dialogue. But China maintained its long usual stance that all parties should speak and act with caution, maintain moving in the direction of dialogue and consultation, and jointly promote the political resolution of the Korean Peninsula issue. Kim Dami, Arirang News.
As tensions simmer over the situation surrounding Ukraine, U.S. President Joe Biden spoke over the phone with his Ukrainian counterpart. According to Reuters, the two leaders discussed joint efforts to de-escalate tensions in the region. Following the meeting, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky took to Twitter to explain that he had a long conversation with President Biden. Thanking Biden for Washington's ongoing military assistance, he also said the two discussed the possibility of financial support for Ukraine.
The U.S. economy saw the largest expansion in almost 40 years last year, seeing substantial growth in the final 3 months of 2021. President Biden hailed the news, stressing that the American economy grew faster than China's for the first time in 20 years. Kim Hyo-sun with more.
In 2021, the U.S. economy grew at its fastest rate in 37 years. According to a report published by the Commerce Department on Thursday, U.S. GDP, the total output of all goods and services, jumped 5.7%. That's the biggest increase since 1984, when the figure exceeded 7%. The country's economy recorded a 6.9% annual growth rate in the fourth quarter, well above the 5.5% predicted by most economists. Since July 2020, when the U.S. experienced the peak of the first COVID-19 wave, the country's economy has grown for 6 consecutive quarters. This even included a 33% expansion in the third quarter of that year. President Biden praised the country's growth. In a statement, he said that during his first year in office, the American economy not only grew at its fastest pace in nearly 4 decades, but also recorded its largest job growth in history. He added that for the first time in 2 decades, the U.S. economy grew faster than China's. He then urged U.S. lawmakers to swiftly pass his administration's Build Back Better Act, which entails a $1.75 trillion investment in social programs and climate policy. President Biden said this could contribute to sustaining growth momentum. Kim Hyo-sun, Arirang News.
Now it's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now. North Korea fired yet more missiles into the sea off its eastern coast on Thursday. Watchers say the unusually fast pace in testing, even for North Korea, is a clear signal the North is desperate to put as much pressure as it can on the US government over long-stalled talks. Now, on the US side, they want the North to give up its nuclear weapons and long-range ballistic missiles. North Korea, in return, wants some kind of breathing room when it comes to the crippling US-led sanctions that are imposed on the regime.
The regime also issued a threat last week, saying it would look closely into restarting the testing of nuclear bombs and ICBMs, which many experts believe could potentially reach the U.S. mainland. For more on the crisis, we connect to Mark Barry, the associate editor of the International Journal on World Peace. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning.
So North Korea says it will reconsider its moratorium on testing nuclear weapons and long-range missiles over what it calls hostile U.S. moves. What do you think of the timing and the real reason behind the North's current behavior?
Well, I think the most important thing is to know that there's a domestic audience or constituency that Kim Jong-un first and foremost has to address. And you have the 80th birth anniversary of Kim Jong-il coming up on February 16th, the 110th birthday of Kim Il-sung on April 15th. So this is part of a typical North Korean pattern of going through certain gyrations, certain fairly predictable, fairly familiar routines. And the missile testing is part of it. Testing, of course, for its own purposes, but also as a way of assuring the elite and the populace that this is a strong regime. The interesting thing is that on the front page of Nodong Shinmun this morning, it's all about agriculture, not about the missiles. That was on page 2. But I think it's primarily a domestic audience, and secondarily, it's a foreign audience, but not only including the U.S. and Japan and South Korea. It's also an audience that includes China and Russia.
Well, Mark, I didn't know you were such a regular consumer of the Nodong Shinmun, but that's good to know. North Korea seemed annoyed.
I do follow Twitter.
Right. That the South Korean military dismissed the regime's claims that it has this hypersonic missile. Seoul said it's more than likely the missiles it fired earlier this month are just regular ballistic missiles or some variation upon that. Firstly, do you really think the North is irritated by what Seoul says in that regard? And do you think it is actually likely that North Korea has some kind of hypersonic missile within its vast arsenal?
They'll always react irritated to anybody who says that they don't have something that they claim they have. But the important thing is that their track record shows that they're able to make it to the goal, and they could learn from their mistakes. And they may or may not be getting some clandestine assistance from some Russian scientists who need a little extra cash for their pocket. And certain countries can look the other way, but only to a certain extent. But I do think that they're on the way towards it, but they're probably not leading the pack because the U.S. and China and Russia are much more ahead of them.
So, Mark, out of concern, what would it mean for South Korea if North Korea actually begins testing nuclear weapons and firing long-range missiles again? How do you think should Seoul kind of prepare for this?
Well, I think the whole region is in upheaval. And as the Soviets used to say, there's a change, ongoing change in the correlation of forces. And I think Kim looks at things this way, and he's trying to do a masterful martial arts move politically, because this is always what they would tell visitors confidentially, that that's their greatest strength, is to make these masterful black belt type of moves politically, trying to improve their overall political position. The economy doesn't come first and probably doesn't even come second. So I think that they're going to ratchet up the tensions some more, but I think that Guam and the testing of an intermediate range ballistic missile is possibly more likely in the cards. And I think Seoul has to realize that the status quo that's been there for over 70 years cannot continue, and they cannot totally rely on anybody, including the United States, to really back them up and help change the situation. They're going to have to be extraordinarily astute and clever and be able to work with the U.S., Japan, China, and Russia, regardless of who wins the presidency.
And finally, when you touch upon the South Korean presidency, President Moon Jae-in will be out of office. His single 5-year term coming to an end in just a matter of weeks now, really. And it seems, at least in terms of foreign policy, President Biden's focus very much on Russia, Ukraine, China, and you could argue Iran as well, rather than North Korea. It seems as though North Korea is crying out for attention from Washington. If President Biden doesn't give them what they want in that regard, do you expect the regime, to keep trying to raise the stakes with these tests?
They will, because, but they have to do it very carefully, because they don't want to see a Chinese reaction, whether it's to all of a sudden start backing the sanctions more powerfully, or even a Russian reaction, which can take various forms. I think they will continue to ratchet up the tensions, and I think at some point, maybe by late spring, if the tensions continue past Kim Il-sung's birth anniversary, Biden may have to send Wendy Sherman to make a return visit to Pyongyang and to meet the son of the leader that she met back in October of 2000. I think it's going to come to that, because North Korea needs to find a landing that's acceptable to it, and not something that's acceptable just to China or to any other neighbor.
All right, Mark, thank you so much for your insights. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you, and have a Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
South Korea's prime minister is calling on lawmakers to swiftly pass the government's more than $11.5 billion extra budget proposal, most of which will be used to help small businesses impacted by virus prevention measures. However, the two major parties both want the budget to be modified to ensure more of the money goes straight into the pockets of business owners. Lee Kyung-in with the details.
South Korea's parliament kicked off its February provisional session on Thursday, where this year's first COVID-19 relief fund is expected to be passed. On the first day, Prime Minister Kim Bo-kyum addressed lawmakers, calling for the approval of the government's recent extra budget proposal. That budget is worth some 14 trillion Korean won, or $11.6 billion US, and mostly goes to support pandemic-hit small businesses. Just last month, expanded relief funds have been provided to more recipients. But Kim said extra help is needed immediately due to extended restrictions with the emergence of Omicron.
Speed is more important than anything for this extra budget. The support plan included in the bill should be swiftly delivered to business owners.
Most of the budget will be used to provide some 3.2 million small businesses with some $2,500 each. There's also $1.2 billion to secure more hospital beds and COVID-19 pills. The rest will be set aside as an emergency fund. Lawmakers will start reviewing the extra budget bill on February 3rd, right after the Lunar New Year holiday. But both the major parties are currently calling for the budget to be increased 2 to 3-fold to roughly $29 billion. The ruling Democratic Party says relief funds should also cover freelancers in the entertainment sector, taxi drivers, and others who are excluded now. The main opposition People Power Party says some $8,000 should be provided to each business. However, it remains to be seen whether their request can actually be reflected in the bill, as the government is saying no to any increase given the government's finances. The finalized bill was submitted for a vote in a plenary session. The date is currently undecided. 이경은 아리랑 뉴스.
Samsung Electronics has reported its highest ever sales. It did so last year, led by the success of its chip business as well as its new lineup of phones. Record sales at LG Electronics as well, thanks to that company's home appliance sector, which is leading the pack now in the global market. Ji-young with the details.
Samsung Electronics posted better-than-expected earnings in 2021. According to the firm's earnings guidance on Thursday, its estimated operating profit last year was around $43 billion, around 44% higher compared to 2020. This is the company's third highest operating profit ever and the largest since 2018 semiconductor boom period. Sales hit a record $232 billion, up 18% compared to the year before. Operating profit in the final 3 months of 2021 was around $11 billion, up 53% on-year. The surprising earnings were led by semiconductors with $78 billion in sales, making Samsung the world's market leader, topping Intel for the first time in 3 years.
2021's strong earnings were led by the rise in the average selling price of memory semiconductors in the first to third quarters in 2021, compared to the previous year. Another factor was an increase in the shipments of OLED products and an improvement in the profitability of smartphones.
Samsung Electronics' strong earnings were also largely due to its latest smartphone series, including the Galaxy Z Fold 3 and Galaxy Z Flip 3. 1 million of these new foldable phones were sold in the 39 days after their release, and around 8 million of Samsung's foldable phone models were sold last year overall. LG Electronics also posted an earnings surprise last year, recording an all-time high in sales. According to the company's guidance report, estimated sales came to about $62 billion last year, up almost 29% on-year. This is the first time the company's yearly sales figure has topped 70 trillion won, which is about $58 billion. LG Electronics' yearly sales ranked first among global companies for the first time, beating America's Whirlpool sales of around $22 billion. The company said strong sales of LG's home appliances, along with an expansion of major markets abroad, have helped boost revenue. Ji-young, Arirang News.
LG Energy Solution went public on the benchmark KOSPI on Thursday after having South Korea's largest ever initial public offering. Although the shares didn't quite hit double the IPO price, as many retail investors had hoped, it still became the nation's second most valuable company, only trailing, as you might expect, Samsung Electronics. Kim Sung-min with the details.
South Korea's main boss on Thursday saw another blockbuster market debut, with LG Energy Solution becoming the country's second most valuable company. The battery producer made its trading debut on the benchmark KOSPI. It opened at 597,000 won, or about $496, almost double the IPO price. While the shares stalled early on, falling as much as 25% shortly after trading started, it gained strength again in the afternoon to close at 505,000 won. Despite the fall, its market capitalization stood at around $98 billion when the market closed, largely thanks to its high opening price. The company now sits second, overtaking SK hynix, with Samsung Electronics remaining as a front-runner. Spun out of LG Chem, LG Energy Solution is the world's second largest battery producer, with more than 20% of the global electric vehicle market, supplying Tesla and General Motors, among others. With a highly anticipated market debut finishing up somewhat disappointingly, some pundits believe that other firms awaiting their market debut could also be affected, especially with lackluster market conditions.
Well, the shares of LG Energy Solution are falling, and more importantly, the market itself is in a downward trend. So the fact that the battery producer failed to open its shares at more than twice the IPO price along with the downturn trend could definitely set a negative tone for the upcoming IPOs.
South Korea's KOSPI market witnessed some huge debuts throughout the year, including Hyundai Engineering, Hyundai Oil Bank, and SSG.com. 김성민, Arirang News.
Welcome to Dialogue This Week. In this corner, we invite guests from in and out of Korea to talk about a wide variety of issues, ranging from culture and sports to the latest trends around the world. Now, we are just a week away from the opening of the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics. And with 2 years of the pandemic already behind us, Beijing is bracing itself for the arrival of thousands of Olympians, officials, and support staff, including from countries where the highly transmissible Omicron variant is raging. Now, in order to limit the spread of the infection, China is sealing the entire games inside a so-called closed-loop system, a bubble completely cut off from the rest of the city. The bubble is welcoming an estimated 11,000 people from around the world. And to give you a brief summary of how the bubble works, anyone entering the bubble must be fully vaccinated or face an additional 21-day quarantine upon arrival in Beijing before being allowed into the bubble. And once inside the bubble, participants will be tested every day and must wear face masks at all times. And what's more startling is that the high stakes for everyone who catches COVID. Participants who test positive will be immediately removed from the games. So will China be able to keep the games with the COVID-19 safe? And what specialities will this year's Olympic have? For answers to this, we have Ben Cowling, Chair Professor of Epidemiology at the University of Hong Kong, and Yu Ji-ho, sports writer at Yonhap News Agency, both via Skype. Thank you for coming on.
Hi.
So, yes. Well, Dr. Cowling, if we can start with a mythbuster, 2 years into the global COVID-19 pandemic, and there's a lot of confusion over whether it's easier for viruses to spread in the wintertime because more people stay indoors and ventilate less because of the cold, or that it spreads less because the air is drier in winter. Can you set the record straight for us? How does weather play into the situation comparing to, last year's Summer Olympics to the upcoming Winter Olympics, Winter Games?
I think we know that in general viruses spread a little bit better in the winter, but COVID can actually spread pretty well at any time of the year. We do know for viruses like COVID, they prefer slightly to spread in cooler weather. The viruses prefer it when it's cool and dry. For ourselves, our mucous membranes tend to dry out a little bit when it's drier and when it's cold as well. And so that puts us at higher risk of getting infected if there's virus around. And then, as you mentioned, people spend more times indoors when it's cold, more time in crowded conditions when it's cold. And so all of these factors together mean that we do see more transmission. And that's going to be a risk for the Winter Olympics. They're going to spend a lot of time indoors. And if there's just one case in the room, in the venue, that's going to be a risk of an outbreak for sure.
So we should take more precautions during this Winter Games. So And on Sunday, the Beijing Olympic Committee and Chinese authorities announced the lowering of threshold for producing a negative COVID-19 test for athletes arriving for the event. Now, the cycle threshold value was lowered from 40 to 35. What exactly is this cycle threshold, and what do these numbers actually mean?
The cycle threshold is a number that we get out of the PCR test, and a lower CT value actually means a higher viral load. Generally, for people that are diagnosed early in their illness with COVID, their CT value could be in the 20s, sometimes even less than 20. And then as the illness progresses, the viral load might go up a little bit, and then it will tend to decline slowly. And when we find CT values above 35, that's low viral loads, and it tends to be when people are recovering. And what this means for the Olympics is, fortunately, some people who arrive in Beijing may be recovering from COVID. Maybe they had COVID a month earlier. They've still got a little bit of virus in their body. They're not contagious. And under the previous rule, those people would have been disqualified and sent to hospital for isolation for maybe 2 or 3 weeks. Under the new rule, they're okay. They can continue to the Olympic Village. They can compete. They don't pose a risk to the other competitors. So I think that's a good move.
Now let's bring Ji-ho into the conversation. So with a week left until the opening ceremony, when is the deadline for countries to announce their status of participation for the Olympics? And so far, what countries have confirmed their boycott?
Well, the deadline to submit all the athletic entries fell on Monday this week. So we can confirm that there will be 91 countries, nearly 2,900 athletes competing for a record 109 gold medals in 7 sports in Beijing and around Beijing during the Winter Olympics. Now, in terms of boycotts, if you're just talking about the diplomatic boycotts, in terms of countries not sending their official government delegations, the U.S. obviously leading the way for a few other countries: Canada, Australia, Belgium, Britain, Lithuania, New Zealand, and I believe the latest might have been Denmark joining the U.S. and a few other countries in not sending official delegations to Beijing. But in terms of just participating in action on the slopes, snow and ice, there will be 91 countries, with an exception of North Korea, which was actually banned by the IOC from competing in the Winter Games this time after skipping the Tokyo Games last summer.
Right. Then, as a sports correspondent yourself, what can you say is different about this year's Winter Olympics in comparison to previous Winter Games, whether it be due to COVID-19 or other changes to the event itself?
Well, everything. This is the first Winter Games held during the pandemic. And obviously, some of us, like myself, had some experience with the Summer Games in the pandemic. But this is a different game. We've got a new threat in the form of the Omicron variant, and obviously the rapid spread of the virus, this variant in a lot of the other parts of the world. There will be a lot more restrictions in terms of the health and safety protocols. You mentioned daily testing earlier, with all the participants. And basically, there will be a lot of things that Winter Olympic athletes have not experienced in previous games. And talking about also the competition itself, there will be some new medal events, including men's and women's big air freestyle skiing, monobob in women's bobsleigh, mixed team competitions in freestyle skiing aerials, ski jumping and snowboard cross, and finally mixed relay event in short track speed skating.
So there's a lot of things to look forward to. Now, let's go back to Professor Cowling. Different countries have different vaccine mandates for minors. Now, the COVID-19 requirements set out by the Beijing Olympics organizers requires those not fully vaccinated isolate for 3 weeks upon arrival in China before entering the closed-loop management system of the event. But there are exceptions to this requirement, including those with medical conditions or athletes under 18 whose home country has yet to approve vaccinations for minors. For example, Russia. So how do you think these factors might play into the possible risks at the event?
Well, I think ideally it would be great if every arriving athlete could be quarantined for at least 14 days, because we know that's a very effective way to keep infections out of the community, in this case, out of the Olympic Village. But in reality, athletes aren't going to be able to do that. They often come in just for their event and then leave again. So I don't think that the lack of quarantine quarantine for minors is going to be a big issue. What is actually going to be a big issue is a lot of the other competitors who are fully vaccinated, adults, of course, coming into the Olympic Village without any quarantine. I think so far about 1.5% of arriving people for the Olympics have tested positive on arrival. I think that there'll be another at least 1 or 2% of people who become positive during their stay in the Olympic Village. And that's just the infections that were present before arrival. If there's any transmission in the Olympic Village, then of course there could be even more infections. So I think the minors is a minor issue. I think the big issue is actually that people are coming in without quarantine. And I do worry that some athletes are going to have their events spoiled. They're going to be sent to isolation because they test positive, unfortunately. And that's going to be a shame for them.
Well, we'll have to wish for the best. But as we've mentioned earlier, this closed-loop management system includes rigorous COVID-19 countermeasures that have been put in place for the Winter Olympics. So once within the loop, all athletes and personnel will have to take daily COVID-19 tests and will not be able to access the outside world during their time in Beijing. So Chi-ho, can you remind us how conditions were different for athletes at the recent Tokyo Summer Olympics that were also held amid the pandemic?
Right. I think things are a little less restrictive back in Tokyo. With the rules being laid out by Beijing, it sounds like this is going to be a far different experience for them coming into these Olympic Games. Now, after 14 days in Tokyo, things are loosened up a little bit for all the participants. You could, take maybe public transit, kind of get out in town a little bit, maybe venture out. But there will be no such thing in Beijing. There will be inside the bubble the whole time during the stay. But some of the other elements that Beijing is bringing back from Tokyo, maybe taking the cues from Tokyo, is that the athletes will, I guess, be recommended or, I guess, kind of supposed to leave the country entirely within maybe 48 hours of the end of the competition. If you look at some of the past Olympics, a lot of the athletes who were done early in the games, they would kind of stay back, maybe see the city a little bit and go to different games and cheer on athletes from their own countries and kind of attend different sports just for the fun of it. But there will be no such thing allowed in Beijing, just as was the case in Tokyo last year.
Then what about for spectators? The Tokyo Summer Olympics were essentially held behind closed doors. So what about for the Beijing Olympics? Will fans be allowed in? And will you yourself be at the event? Well,
I'm traveling myself. In fact, on Monday to Beijing. I guess I'm walking into a bubble myself. Now, in terms of the spectators, pretty much the same deal. No tickets will be sold to the general public in China. They will, quote unquote, invite a select few people into some of the events. The last I heard was some of the civil servants and university students in the area will be allowed to attend. But again, there will be a lot of restrictions too. No vocal cheering, no singing, no very limited physical interactions within themselves when they're watching these events. So it will be very eerie, very quiet compared to obviously other Winter Games held before the pandemic.
Well, we will have to hope to talk to you after your experience there. Now, under these restrictions, Michael Ryan, the emergencies director for the WHO, expressed confidence in the prevention measures implemented by the Olympics organizers and did not foresee any increased risk of transmission. And Beijing has strictly forbidden any contact between the event participants and the Beijing public to the extent that passersby are not allowed to help, even if they see an Olympic vehicle crash. So how do you see things as a health expert, Professor Cowling?
I'm worried because Omicron is such a challenge. Just a handful of cases of Omicron in the Olympic Village could cause havoc. Unfortunately, we know how quickly it can spread, but I know athletes will themselves be being very cautious about things. So I hope that there won't be too many infections in the Olympic Village, and I hope that only a small number of athletes will ultimately be disappointed and unable to compete. As for the city of Beijing, I think the barrier between the Olympic bubble and the city of Beijing is pretty good. I don't know if it's going to be perfect, but it's pretty good. And I think that there'll be a minimal number of infections spreading into the city of Beijing. If they're lucky, maybe none. If they're unlucky, maybe a handful. And in China, they're very, very good at stopping outbreaks in the community with their lockdowns, mass testing, and so on. So I don't think it's a threat as such to the city of Beijing. But in the Olympic Village, I am worried because Omicron is really difficult to stop.
Now, just briefly before we let you go, Chi-ho, what events and rising stars would you like to highlight for the upcoming Olympics?
I think for Korean fans, they will mostly watch short track speed skating. This is an event where Korea has been the most successful country in the Winter Games history. 24 gold medals, 48 medals overall so far. And I think, if Korea were to win maybe a couple of gold medals, most likely they would come from short track. And Choi Min-jung, the two-time gold medalist from Pyeongchang 4 years ago, once again favored to win a couple of medals herself. And up-and-coming 20-year-old skater Lee Yoo-bin might be in for a surprise in Beijing also. On the slopes, Lee Sang-ho, the reigning silver medalist in men's parallel giant slalom in the alpine snowboarding, is looking pretty good. He's a World Cup points leader so far, and he's in good form going into his second straight Olympics.
Okay, we will have to look forward to it. Well, I'm afraid we will have to wrap up our show at this point. Thank you so much for making time for us, Professor Cowling and Chi-ho. We'll look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
South Korea on Thursday inched closer to securing their 10th consecutive berth to the World Cup finals after beating Lebanon on away soil. South Korean forward Cho Gue-sung scored late in the first half in the Group A match at Seda International Stadium. The Taeguk Warriors now have 17 points with 5 wins, 2 draws, and are second in the group, with Iran defeating Iraq 1-0 on the same day. Iran have qualified for their 3rd straight World Cup. The top 2 teams from the group automatically qualify for a place in Qatar. The first joint webtoon project between Naver Webtoon and Hybe, the management company behind BTS, was a huge success upon its release a couple of weeks ago here in South Korea. Our Kim Bok-young has more on the project and digs a little deeper to find out the secret of its success.
The BTS-inspired webtoon Seven Fates Chaco exceeded 50 million views in only 2 days since its release in mid-January. And as well as its links to the K-pop superstars, the webtoon is also based on the historical facts of the Joseon dynasty. The webtoon's name Chaco comes from Chaco Kapsa, who were a group of professional tiger hunters. During the Joseon dynasty, many tigers lived in Korea's mountains. Documents such as the veritable records of the Joseon dynasty and Isabella Bird Bishop's Korea and Her Neighbors show that the animals attacked and killed many people.
The records say half of the Joseon people went on a tiger hunt, while the other half would go to the funeral of those who have died because of the tigers. Another says tigers cut off traffic routes and appeared in the royal palace yards, causing panic.
To tackle such issues, King Sejong, known as the inventor of the Korean alphabet Hangul, formed a group of professional tiger hunters named Chakogapsa. They were the most skillful and courageous hunters selected by a test among the volunteers who can run fast and are good at archery and throwing spears. Tigers were considered fearful yet also respectable and brave, and thus images of tigers were used to ward off evil spirits.
We would create a shrine for tigers, and they were considered very awe-inspiring. So people would hold ancestral rites with tiger pictures in front. They were also dauntless, so people would hang pictures of them on walls to prevent evil spirits.
The high prices for tigers led even civilian hunters to chase the creatures, leading the number of wild tigers to fall and the chakogapsa to disappear. Now, comics give us a chance to look closely into history and also think about what we should do not to hunt tigers, but rather protect them. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
Now let's get an update on some of the headlines from around the world. And for this, we're joined by Lee Seung-jae from our Arirang newsroom. Good morning, Seung-jae.
Good morning to you guys.
Yeah, good morning. Let's start in Argentina. Thousands of people are marching the streets of its capital. They are demanding that the government there doesn't repay its debt to the IMF.
That's right. Quite a scene over in Buenos Aires on Thursday with thousands of Argentines marching to reject Argentina's deal with the IMF. Now, as protesters have long rallied against President Alberto Fernandez's decision to renegotiate the country's IMF debt, they're now pressuring the government to default on the first payment due this Friday. Now, the figure on the first payment, $1 billion. The country is continuing tense negotiations with the IMF to renegotiate the loan of around $40 billion. Now, protesters have blamed the IMF for austerity measures that worsened a major economic crisis from 2001 to 2002, which left many Argentines in poverty. They demand the government not pay the debt, which they call a scam. However, the program with the IMF is widely seen as Argentina's only option to avoid an economic meltdown. Now, survivors of the Auschwitz concentration camp commemorated the 77th Liberation Day on Thursday with an event at the Auschwitz Museum. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, most of the testimonies delivered by the survivors were pre-recorded and aired during the ceremony. And for some, the moment they arrived at the concentration camp is still fresh in their mind.
When in August 1944 I found myself on the ramp in Birkenau, I was one of over 500 Polish children who were taken from the uprising in Warsaw. On the first transport of civilians, we were immediately taken by SS staff and the capo, the guards of the camp.
Now, the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum and Memorial preserves the death camp set up on Polish soil by the Nazis during World War II, and more than 1.1 million people, mostly Jews, perished in gas chambers at the camp or from starvation, cold, or disease. 2 years ago, NBA legend Kobe Bryant, his teenage daughter Gianna, and 7 others died after their helicopter crashed on a hillside near Los Angeles. Now, marking the 2 years since the crash, a 73-kilogram bronze statue depicting Kobe and Gianna was installed on Wednesday. The statue shows the pair wearing basketball uniforms and sharing a loving glance as Gigi holds Kobe's hands as a rest on her shoulder. Now, also engraved on the statue's pedestal are the names of all 9 victims of the crash, as well as an inscription of Kobe's famous quote, "Heroes come and go, but legends are forever." And finally, a black diamond weighing a staggering 555.55 carats is going up for auction at Sotheby's. Also known as a carbonado diamond, the piece possibly came from outer space. According to a geologist, the diamond's origin is shrouded in mystery, as there have not been many like it found on Earth. The black diamond, which is dubbed the Enigma, is estimated to be 2.6 to 3.2 billion years old and is expected to fetch between $4 to $7 million.
Good morning. It's a colder start to the day. We'll have temperatures nearing right around the seasonal averages today. Then more freezed air moving in for the start of this holiday weekend. So a cold advisory is in place across central regions and Gyeongsang-Pukto province, while a dry weather advisory has been reissued for Gyeongsang-do and surrounding regions, and that's including Busan and Ulsan. A sub-zero start for most regions under partly sunny skies, Air quality has improved except in the west of Gangwon-do and Chungcheong-pukto province. Then afternoon highs will be 1 to 3 degrees lower than yesterday. Seoul going up to 3 degrees. Daegu and Jeju will be topping out at 7 degrees Celsius this afternoon. Then some harsh winter weather is in the forecast for this year's Seollal holiday. Starting the holiday on a freezing note, then on the day of Seollal itself, central regions and Jeollado provinces are forecast to receive heavy snowfall. So travelers need to stay updated with the latest forecast. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the world.
And that's all we have for now. Mark and I will be back at 8 a.m. Korea time next week. If you're watching us in Korea, enjoy the Lunar New Year holiday. I'm Kim Mo-gyan.
Yeah, I'm Mark Brim. Have a great day. Happy New Year. If you're watching us in Korea, get some rest. And thank you as always for joining us. Until next time, goodbye.
저는 메이저리그